Welcome to my session for the Scottish Summit 2021. I'm coming to you here from Jacksonville, Florida in the United States. I'm joining you from here in my office. I am happy to be joining all of you today, and today I am going to talk about staying in control of teams, not letting your users run wild. So in a nutshell, Teams governance. So for the next 45 minutes, we're going to look at several different aspects of governance in Microsoft Teams. But before we do that, let's thank some of our sponsors. Even though these are virtual, we still have sponsors. There are still lots of costs and logistics associated with these. So a big thanks to ScriptRunner, to DQ, to Proximio, Redspire, AgileSys, and Hitachi Solutions, all for being sponsors of the event, for helping to put this on. So go check out their websites, go check out the different products, the different services they have to offer, and a big thanks to all of those sponsors. So diving into our topic, one of those things that you may ask is, why do we care? Why do I care what my users are doing in Teams? Why do I care about not letting my users run wild? To kind of kick things off, let's talk about sprawl. Sprawl is an irregular spread or scattered group or mass, an unplanned growth that happens outside of set limits. And I come from a SharePoint background. I have seen sprawl in SharePoint. I have seen sprawl in Teams. But let's get out of technology and compare this to cities. Here in the US, one of the cities with the most sprawl is out in California, Riverside, San Bernardino in California. And ironically, one of the cities with the least sprawl is New York City. So when we talk about sprawl, it's not necessarily how big something is or how large it's grown, but it really goes back to, in that definition from Merriam-Webster, is it a controlled growth? Are we keeping an eye on what's going on? Are we planning for the growth and for the expansion of Microsoft Teams, just like planners have to go into the expansion of the growth of cities, of countries, of counties? So as we talk about this, don't think that we're trying to limit what users can do or we're trying to keep everything small. But we're really trying to make sure that as we look at Microsoft Teams within that Microsoft 365 platform, we're making sure it grows in a controlled manner, something that we can handle and keep a grasp on. And why might you want to do that? Some of the effects of sprawl, holes in security, kind of comparing back to cities again. If a city grows out of control, you may not have a police force to handle the growth. Citizens may become unsafe. Same thing can happen within your Teams environment. If you're not controlling it, have an eye on what's going on, maybe you don't have a full grasp of security. How is security handled in these different teams? Are external users being invited to these teams or not? And that can cause security issues. Another one is compliance. How do you manage compliance? Do you have sensitive information within Teams? Do you have personally identifiable information? People are concerned about privacy, about the privacy of their information. So we want to make sure that we stay in compliance with laws that we need to adhere to or compliance regulations. Another aspect of it, just like once a city starts growing and growing and growing, and if it's not growing in a controlled manner, you can soon lose control of it. And it's really hard to come back from where it is and rein it all back in. Same thing can happen in Microsoft Teams. And as we go through this, it's all about finding balance. Some people think governance and they think, I am locking this down. I'm not letting my users do anything. I'm putting all these controls and limits in place. Well, if you put too many controls and limits in place on what a user can do, what that barrier to entry is, they're going to go find something else. They're not going to keep using Teams. They're not going to want to leverage the tools you've given them. And that's going to result in even more sprawl. They're going to go find other tools. You're going to have other security issues, other compliance issues, because they're no longer using what you've given them. And then on the other side of that balance is if you don't have any controls, if you don't have any limits, if you don't have any plan for how you're going to grow Teams, it is going to sprawl. You are going to lose control of what's going on within your Teams environment. As we're going through this, we're going to try to talk about different things you can do that will help you maybe find that balance where you're putting some controls and limits on place to help with sprawl, but you're not locking it down so tightly that users aren't able to get their jobs done, that barrier to entry isn't getting so low. Before we dive into the agenda and everything we're going to go over today, just a little bit more about me. My name is Ben Stegink. This is my family. I have a wife and 4 kids who are 8, 6, 4, and 2. So we stay pretty busy. I have my own company, Untitled. I am the owner, the chief consultant there. I have been doing that. I've had my company now for almost 10 years. I have been working with SharePoint for 15 years, at least 8 years with Office 365, since before it was Office 365, it was BPAWS. Anyways, a few websites out there, benstegink.com, my personal blog. I don't post to my blog actually a ton. You'll also see at the bottom there I have a podcast. That's where most of my new content goes. It's a weekly show where we talk all about Microsoft 365 and Azure. Scott Hogan and I host that, the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast. I also have my company website, intelligent.com. And then I have a weekly newsletter all about Microsoft 365 news, mscloudreport.com. If you want to look me up on Twitter, at Ben Stegink. Frankly, you can also just search for Ben Stegink. I am the only Ben Stegink that is out there. So if you just search for my name, you'll find me. I own pretty much the whole first page of any search engine that you might use. So let's dive into the agenda and how we're going to go about tackling Teams governance today. First, we're going to take a brief look at what is Microsoft Teams, because that plays a big part, believe it or not, in governance. Next, we're going to look at governing the Microsoft Teams lifecycle, creating teams, archiving teams, deleting teams. What is that process so you don't have a bunch of stale content out there? Governing Microsoft Teams functionality. So even beyond just creating teams or deleting teams is how are you managing that functionality? What users are allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, what functionality you may want to enable or disable. And then finally, the content that goes in Microsoft Teams. Not only can you have a sprawl of just team after team after team being created, that life cycle, or a sprawl due to functionality just being wide open or people leaving because functionality is locked down, you also have content you're putting in Teams. How do you govern some of that content in Microsoft Teams? So we're going to look at those 4 aspects here over the course of the next 35 minutes or so. So first of all, before governance, what is Teams so we can understand it? At its core, Microsoft Teams is a slew of different products. It's Office 365 or Microsoft 365 groups. OneDrive plays a part, SharePoint plays a part, Azure AD. Even though Skype for Business is gone, some of the stuff under the covers is still Skype for Business. You have Exchange. And then you have a whole bunch of Azure services all supporting Teams. As we go into governance and putting some of that governance in place in Microsoft Teams, you really do have to think about all of those other products that are under the covers. All of those are going to come into play as we go through this presentation today. To kick things off, Teams creation. Let's just kind of dive in and look at that Teams creation process and what's involved there. The first thing you have is you just have the out of the box creating teams with what you're given, nothing else added to it. There's not a lot of control that you have there. You can create them in the Teams client, you can create them in the Teams admin center, you can create them from an Office 365 group. So once you have a SharePoint site or you have an Office 365 group, you can always create a team from there. If you do want to gain a little bit more control, some of the other topics we'll talk about is only allowing teams to be created in a Teams admin center. And I put sort of there because there's a little caveat there. We can also look at, let's leverage some of the other tools in the Microsoft 365 stack. Let's leverage a SharePoint list or Microsoft list now, leveraging Power Automate, PowerShell. You can see some of the tasks there where now you can create teams right within a flow within Power Automate. And then you also do have some ways you can do it with custom apps or some third-party products. Out of the box is the first one. If you're creating teams out of the box, you have some controls that you can put in place there. You can limit that creation of Microsoft Teams so not anybody can use it. It requires an Azure AD Premium license. You are limiting actually Microsoft 365 group creation, which trickles down and then limits Microsoft Teams creation. So those Teams creation ability isn't there within the client. Now you're kind of limiting it to only admins. This is one of those where you may have to be a little careful. If all you're doing is limiting it to admins, you're starting to put some of those roadblocks in the way where someone may go use something else. But when you do create it out of the box, you have a few different options too that can help with governance. First of all, you can do classification or sensitivity labels on groups. These help you categorize them. Sensitivity labels are actually relatively new and really cool in terms of the ways you can limit those. You have kinds of teams, public teams, private teams, org-wide teams. You can leverage team templates, and then you also have naming policies and blocked words within teams, so you can help control teams that way. So diving in, the kinds of groups, classification labels. You have 3 different kinds of groups when it comes to creating Microsoft 365 teams, or kinds of teams, I should say. So the first one is an organizational-wide team. This is a team that is wide open. All of your admins within Microsoft 365 are automatically made owners of this org-wide team. In addition to that, all of your users are made members. So there is nothing you have to do. Every individual in your organization is automatically added to these org-wide teams. You're allowed 5 of these within a Microsoft 365 tenant, and you are limited to 10,000 users within your tenant. If you already have 5 of these created, or if you have more than 10,000 users, this option won't show up when you're creating teams. This is also limited to only the admin being able to create these org-wide teams, but if you want to have a company-wide team, everybody's added to it, you can have some discussions there. These are great. Next, you can choose public teams. Public teams are teams that anyone can join. They're out there for people to find. So as they're using Teams, as they're leveraging their Teams client, they can open it up, go look for these teams, find them, join them. Private teams are limited to, you need to be invited to access these. They're not discoverable, you can't find them, people don't know they exist. The only way to become a member of a private team is to be invited to it or added to it by an owner of that team. Discoverable private teams, I have some question marks here. There's some conflicting information. It appears that discoverable private teams are getting depreciated. Everything used to be discoverable, then it wasn't discoverable, then they were going to give you the option to make it discoverable. The PowerShell commands are out there, so you can still go run a set teams commandlet in PowerShell, make it discoverable. I've read that it's going to be deprecated. I honestly can't find any official documentation on it. If anybody has that, feel free to throw it in the chat. Let me know, but that's why I kind of have a question mark there, is it looks like you can still do it with PowerShell. There's nothing in the GUI to do it. You can't set that as a default. It appears like it's going to go away. Kind of moving on from those kinds of groups is classification. So there is Office 365 group classification or labeling. This purely is that. You can go into PowerShell, you can configure some labels. When you go create a new team, you can set classification on that team. For instance, think demo, client, internal, any of those types of classifications, just to help better define or label that team and what it is. Like I said, it's configured with PowerShell, it's in an Azure AD module. I used to do this. I have since moved on to sensitivity labels. This is very new. Within the last month or so, you can now use sensitivity labels within Microsoft Teams. I actually have about a 20-ish minute YouTube video that walks through all of this. If you want, let me know. I'll try to post the link in the slide deck too, so if you open up the slide deck, I'll post it in the chat. Essentially what sensitivity labels do is they allow you to define a label, a demo site, a team site, a internal site, a confidential site. And what you can do with these sensitivity labels is actually define some of the rules. If a user chooses this sensitivity label, it has to be a private site, or it has to be a public site, or you're going to let the user choose public or private. In terms of sharing, I am going to allow external sharing on this site, or I'm not going to allow external sharing on this site. So maybe it's a confidential site, you're going to force it to private, you're going to force no external sharing. You can even do things like force browser-only access, so people can't use the desktop client of Word, Excel, PowerPoint to edit files in it. They have to use the web-based version. So sensitivity labels actually take away some of the options when you would create a team out of the box. Instead, it lets the user choose a classification, and then all of that's defined for them. So it can better help with that governance and keeping that control in place when it comes to what users are allowed to do within a team. I love this feature. I've turned it on in mine. There is some licensing there based on the functionality. It does actually start leveraging conditional access for SharePoint sites. So in some cases, that's going to require an Azure Active Directory Premium license to enable that. Another thing you can do is team templates. Team templates are pre-built templates. There's a bunch of these out of the box now. Some of them based on sector. There's some retail templates, education templates, healthcare templates, and more recently there's some general templates where now you go in, you create a new team, you get to pick one of these templates. Certain channels, apps, features are all turned on by default according to these templates. These are great things you can leverage to kind of get a kickstart with Microsoft Teams and creating some of those teams in a consistent manner. Finally, with these two, you can actually customize these. This is all PowerShell graph-based at this point in time. There's no UI to create your own team templates. But if that is something you are interested in within your organization, so that users have a template for project sites or for team sites or for client sites, if you're creating teams for every client you have, custom team templates are available. The next thing to take a look at is Office 365 groups, which trickle down to Teams naming policies. This does require Azure AD Premium, P1 or higher, and it's all configured within Azure AD PowerShell for the Microsoft Graph, or you can now do it within the Azure AD Admin Center. And what this does is it allows you to define different rules around how Microsoft Teams are named. Are there certain blocked words you want in there? You do not want people to use certain words within Teams. Let's face it, some people like to get a little creative sometimes when they create teams and may want to use some creative words that you may not want in there, or maybe it's just that you don't want people to use something generic like HR or IT. You want them to be more descriptive, so you go in and block some of those words. You can also do prefix and suffix naming, where you can either take attributes from the user creating the site. If a user is creating a site from a certain department, let's actually prepend or create a suffix of that department name at the beginning of the team so you know what department that team is associated with. Or you can do things like fixed strings, where you just want a certain fixed string at the end of every name. It helps with the SharePoint naming, so if you're looking at your list of SharePoint sites, you can easily identify those created in Teams. With these blocked words, they are case insensitive, so put the word in there, doesn't matter the sensitivity. No character restrictions in terms of the length of words. So you can create some monster strings, you can create some shorter strings, and then you are limited to 5,000 words. I have never seen anybody actually have 5,000 words they want to block within their naming policies, but it's an option. Going into how you can create sites a little bit more. One of those I mentioned was the custom option. Let's say you do want to implement what we mentioned before, where you're limiting the creation of these Office 365 groups, the Microsoft 365 groups, so that they can only be created in the Teams Admin Center. You don't want users clicking on the Create New Team down at the bottom of Teams and creating 20 teams one day just because they felt like it. So you've gone into Azure AD, limited that group creation, but now you still want users to be able to create their own sites. You don't want them to have to call IT to go into the Admin Center every time they want a site. You can do things like leverage SharePoint and Flow or Power Automate and PowerShell so that maybe you create a nice looking Microsoft list that users can go fill out this list, and it routes it through some approval process and leverages Power Automate and a flow within Power Automate, leverages PowerShell within Azure Automation to go out and actually create this team, to create it in a controlled, methodical manner so that you have a nice looking template. You can even allow them to choose what type of team they're creating and take different actions within Flow, within PowerShell to create these teams. You could go out and write a custom app. I know people that have done that. You have a lot of power when it comes to custom apps. And again, the benefits of this, you can align it with your business. You can set up these custom creation processes so that they implement certain content types, or they set certain security restrictions in place. They create some extra document libraries, metadata lists, whatever it is that you need to align this specifically with your business for, you can do it with this custom option. And you're still empowering your users. You're not limiting them. You're just putting a process in place to help with that standardization, to help control that growth so that they're not just going wild. I will say the only way around this is if you have created a bunch of those Office 365 groups or Microsoft 365 groups already, users can still go in and create sites, or teams rather, can create teams from those. Because when you limit team creation to the Admin Center, you're really limiting Microsoft 365 group creation. You're not limiting teams creation. You run into a little bit there, probably minor. If you already have the Office 365 groups, let them create teams from it. There's not a lot you can do to limit that. And then finally, there are some third-party apps. I have one specifically that I partner with. It's a screenshot on the slide. I'm not going to mention any names. This isn't a sales presentation. Let me know if you want to, if you're interested, we can set something up. It's a buy, not build option. You want to pay a little bit. You don't want to build it your own. You can get a nice Teams governance solution in place. You can roll it out quickly. There is some limited flexibility. You're going to be limited to whatever that third party has implemented in terms of customizability, flexibility, but these options are out there. More and more companies, there's probably a handful of them now that I can name off the top of my head that are rolling out various solutions for helping you with that Microsoft Teams governance. Finally, archiving and deleting different teams, going into some of that life cycle. If you do want to archive teams, this is a great option. It is limited to team owners only. They can go in, archive a team. It actually puts everything associated with the team in read-only mode. You get your SharePoint site, your Exchange mailboxes, your calendars, your chats. Everything goes into read-only mode. You can keep it in that read-only archived state for as long as you need to. If you ever need it back, you can restore it from the archive at any time, and you have it there. You can also do with this group expiration policies, so that after a certain amount of time, your team owners are prompted and they get a message. Are you still using this team? Do you still want it? Does it have to be renewed? If they choose to renew it, they can choose to renew it. If not, this team can expire, get deleted, get archived. So team expiration policies are another great thing that actually lives at that Microsoft 365 groups level, but trickles down to teams. Once you do delete a team, this is another one of those. It's limited to team owners only, so don't panic. Your users can't go off and delete all these sites. They do get soft deleted. You can recover them for 30 days. After that 30 days, they are gone. Data's gone for good. SharePoint sites, Exchange mailboxes, chat conversations, everything gets deleted. So be careful with deleting teams. This is one of those where you set up that life cycle. You archive teams. After they've been archived for so long, you find you don't need them, you delete them. If you start tying in some of those custom request processes, you can actually start recording even better dates within that SharePoint list or whatever form you use to request them of when it was requested. And then after so many days, allow users to put in, if it's a project, put in an expiration date. Once that project expires, tie in a flow, tie in Power Automate to send them an email. This project was set to end on this day. Do you still need this team? If not, can we archive it? You can start doing things now with sensitivity labels. Teams that are labeled with this sensitivity label, we need to archive them for 7 years for retention purposes, or we only have to archive it for 30 days. So lots of options there as you start tying all of these different things together within really planning out that team's process. And again, this isn't all about controlling teams. Let's define processes to help make sure our team's environment grows and is used in a manner that really supports the growth and supports the use of it without letting it grow out of control. So that kind of wraps up the life cycle, the creation, the deletion, the archiving, different ways you can create some of those processes in place to get more teams, some of the functionality that you may not necessarily see or know about right out of the gate that's there to help you in that managing the life cycle, the whole creation process of a team. Now we're going to look at Teams functionality a little bit. What can your users do in Teams? What can they not do in Teams? What do you want them or not want them doing in Teams? There is first some org-wide settings. So there's several different org-wide settings that you may want to take a look at. These are settings that apply to all the users, all the teams, organizational wide. The first of these is communication. Certain communication settings, like do you want users communicating with external users, with public Skype users, with other Skype for business or Teams external users. So there's several different communication settings that you may want to look at from that organizational wide standpoint of maybe I don't want my users to be able to communicate with just anybody externally for compliance reasons. The next of these that you may also have is the guest access settings. What can my guests do or not do in Teams in terms of chat, in terms of posting GIFs within chat conversations? Things like private calling. Once I have a guest in my tenant, can they just call anybody in my organization, initiate a private phone call with them? Or do I want to limit some of that? Some of these some of the governance things aren't just about what can my internal users do, but Teams is a collaboration tool. It's designed to also use with external users. So you have to take into consideration what are those external users going to be allowed to do or not allowed to do? Because frankly, I don't want to invite a guest into my organization and maybe have that guest be able to just call up my CEO any day because I have private calling enabled or that one-to-one calling enabled for guests. So some of the guest settings are actually at that org-wide setting level as opposed to some of the policies that we're going to look at later. Another one of those things to look at is team settings, file interaction within Teams, different device settings. I bring up file interaction because by default, when you stand up Teams, it actually allows you to use Teams and add other external file storage systems into a Teams. Box, ShareFile, Google Drive, and maybe one other one by default. It's not coming to me off the top of my head, but those are enabled by default. Users can go in and say, I have this team, I'm not going to use SharePoint, I want to use Box for my files because I don't like SharePoint. Well, that may cause some governance issues because now all of a sudden all your files are in Box and you can't use some of the controls that we'll look at here shortly for managing your content in Teams and governing some of that content, especially if you have sensitive information in there, whether it be the personal identifiable information we talked about before or different classified or restricted information within Teams. You also have things like device settings in terms of what devices can connect, and don't think like laptops and user devices, but more how is that interaction with things like the Surface Hub, with the conference room devices, or with phone devices. So there's a lot of different team settings there at that organizational level that you want to look at. And then finally, controlling Teams apps. If you've ever looked at different tenants, at least especially here in the US, when you start looking at some of the government tenants, the higher security tenants, they actually don't allow some of those third-party apps in there because of security reasons. I'm not saying these are insecure. I'm not saying install apps and your tenant's gonna get hacked, but maybe you don't want all of those apps in there. You don't want users to just be able to go install any third-party apps into your team. Just like we talked about with some of the file storage at that team settings is, I'm going to allow all the Microsoft apps, I'm going to allow them to use tasks, and I'm going to allow them to use Microsoft Dataverse, and I'm going to allow them to take advantage of Yammer and some of those other apps, but I don't want them to necessarily go install any of the third-party apps that are out there. Or I want to kind of pick and choose what apps they are going to be able to use within Teams. Within these org-wide settings, you have some of that control over those Microsoft Teams apps and some of the app policies in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed and how they're going to take advantage of it. Meeting policies. I'm going to look at different policies. I've kind of broken these out. There's some more policies we're going to look at once we get into content within Teams. But for now, meeting policies are another one to think about, and these are a little interesting as you can have meeting policies that apply to users. So think this policy applies, or this policy setting applies to users that join my meeting. You also have manager level policies in terms of, or not manager, but organizer. I'm an organizer. I created this meeting because I, as an organizer, had a certain policy applied to me. Everybody that joins the meeting inherits my policy. And then you also have organizer and user policies where based on how it's applied to an organizer, how it's applied to the user, they kind of work together to create these. This meeting policies or policies can be a presentation or two in and of itself. But I want to make you aware of them. Who in your organization is allowed to actually create meetings? And where are they allowed to create meetings? Are you going to allow Teams meetings? Are you going to enable the Outlook add-in to create meetings? And then once those meetings are created, how is that audio or video set up? Is everybody allowed to share video? Or maybe for whatever reason, you do want to limit video where certain people can't turn on their video. We could go back to a highly secure environment. Let's say that some of your users sit in a secured section within your company, a room within your organization, and maybe there's content that could be on the walls, that could be on a whiteboard, something like that you don't want shared on a video, especially if they jump on and you don't necessarily know who all is going to be on that meeting. So maybe you do something like disable video for those people. Those are different policy settings that you can set up to help control some of that functionality. Content sharing, desktop sharing is a big one. I'm guilty of it myself. I tend to just share my desktop. I don't want to mess with sharing different apps. Just let me share my desktop so everybody can see everything. Well, I've had notifications pop up before. I've been on meetings where notifications have popped up before that users shouldn't see. So maybe you want to do something like actually limit desktop sharing. Users are not allowed to share a whole desktop. They have to share an application because they may get messages or emails or different pop-ups on their computer that you don't want exposed to everybody. So let's kind of control what content sharing can be done. Participants and guests, are you going to let guests start a meeting, or do they have to be admitted by someone within your organization? Or are meetings allowed to start before someone within the organization starts it? All of that is stuff to think about. And again, these are assigned to users. They can be assigned at the group level, at the individual level. You have them assigned to organizers versus participants. But these meeting policies are something to really pay attention to in terms of what you want users or how you want these meetings to be organized to really help make sure that you're managing Teams appropriately. Moving on from there, content in Teams. This one is a big one. I think I can still fit everything in here, but files, emails, chat, all of that stuff is in Teams. How do you govern that, and how do you control that different content in Teams? The first of these we're going to look at is messaging policies. Like I said, there's lots of different policy settings within Teams, but I thought of messaging. This is a little bit more content-based because messaging policies are going to apply to certain chats within Teams. Messaging policies are going to set what internal users can and can't do in Microsoft Teams. And I stress internal there because back when we talked about the guest settings in Teams within your org-wide settings, that's where messaging settings or policies, although they're not really policies at that point in time, get set for the guests. What are guests allowed to do in messaging? When it comes to messaging policies, it is only your internal users. By default, you have a global, organizational-wide default messaging policy that everybody is going to get assigned to by default. If you don't assign them a policy, they're in that org-wide default. You can go ahead and customize this, change it according to your organization. That's the default. From there, you can go down, assign different custom policies, or create custom policies, and then assign them to users. And users can only be in one policy at a time. If they are assigned to one policy and then assigned to another policy, they'll be pulled out of that initial policy, assigned to that second one you added them to. So you can't have them in multiple policies at once. Makes it a whole lot easier when you get into conflicts. Recently, you can start doing group policies as well. So users are assigned to a group. When you start doing group policies, because you can't necessarily dictate that one policy at a time, you have groups ranked. 1, 2, 3, 4. You just go down, rank them numerically. The way that those policies will trickle, if they have a policy assigned to a user, that takes precedence. If they don't have a user policy assigned, if they're in the first group, they'll get that one. Second group, they'll get the second policy. Third group, they'll get the third policy. If they're in the first, third, and fourth group, they'll get the first policy. So it's just a ranked, whichever policy that the group they're in is ranked highest is the policy they'll inherit. Messaging policies are something you may want to think about. As you can see on the slide there's lots of different things you can do here. Maybe you don't want users to be able to edit or delete messages. You need to retain that historical record for various compliance reasons, security reasons. Think if somebody says something inappropriate in chat, but then they have the option to go in and edit it and delete it. Maybe you actually want them to edit it so they can go fix it themselves. Maybe you don't, because you need to keep that for records for HR. Do you trust your users to use GIFs or not? And what category do you want to set it? Do you want to set it strict, or do you want to let them add pretty much any GIF in there that they want? So as you can see, there's lots of different messaging policies that you can put in place to really help you as users start sending messages, leveraging Teams for messages, to put some controls in place to really make sure you as an organization are being responsible and not allowing conversations to spin out of control, not allowing people to be hurtful to others within their conversations. Which actually brings us to our next one. Did you like that segue? It's like I knew it was coming. Is communication compliance within Microsoft Teams. This is one of those that if you're leaving everything wide open, maybe you want to implement communication compliance where you're actually monitoring chats that go on. This does not block it, but rather looks for things like offensive language or sensitive information, credit card numbers, government ID numbers, tax numbers, any of that sensitive information. If you're breaking regulatory compliance, or even if you have custom rules or custom sensitivity labels that you want to put in place, you can monitor and alert when any of this is detected in Teams. When you start looking at some of the things like offensive language, it's leveraging some AI in the background to try to pick up on language that frankly should not be used within an organization when you're talking to another person. This does monitor both Teams and Exchange. Your emails, if some of this gets sent out in an email, it is pretty much near real time in terms of that alerting. Email's going through your Exchange server. It's able to kind of pick it up when it goes through there. Teams chat, it's kind of monitoring it, scanning it, looking through it. That can take a little while, up to 24 hours for it to be picked up. But then once some of this, the communication compliance or breaking compliance within your communication is picked up, those alerts can go to a shared mailbox. They get shown in the Office 365 supervisory dashboard. You'll get some notifications in Outlook on the web. So that, again, those don't get blocked, but those alerts could get sent to HR or get sent to managers so they can follow up on those and make sure that they're really just helping their employees to be responsible with their emails and with their Teams chat. So this is one of those that I find not a lot of people know about or look at when it comes to Microsoft 365, but can really help with that monitoring of content and information that's exchanged, both within Teams as well as within Exchange Online. Something else to keep in mind when it comes to governance is data loss prevention, or DLP, within Teams. And like I said, Teams touches all the things: Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and then you still have your chat and channel messages. Data loss prevention starts blocking certain data from being shared. We had mentioned in communication compliance sensitive information. Maybe sensitive information shouldn't just be a notification, but should be outright blocked. Don't send bank numbers via email, or don't put bank numbers in chat. Those are not allowed. Data loss prevention policies are something you can implement across the board. Again, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, chat, and channels, to prevent that sensitive information or information that even you define from being shared either internally, or maybe it's allowed to be shared internally but not externally. It will limit that sharing of data to those various users. So data loss prevention, another good one to really think about to help put some controls in place to help those users as they share information, as they collaborate, not to do anything that's going to cause trouble for the company down the road. And then retention policies. Teams uses almost all of these locations as well when it comes to retention policies. However, Teams does require its own retention policies when it comes to chat and channel messages. Retention policies are essentially saying, once this content hits a certain time frame, go ahead and delete it. We don't need it anymore. We don't want to keep it anymore, because if we keep it, we can be liable for this information that's stored, or if we're audited, it can get dragged out in the audit. So after 7 years, after 10 years, after 20 years, whatever it may be, go ahead and delete this content. This is, when people think governance, they don't always think deletion, but a big part of governance is also getting rid of stuff you don't need. Clean out that junk drawer in your house that has a bunch of stuff in it you just don't need anymore. Keep Teams clean. Keep your Microsoft 365 environment to just the content you need. Don't let it get cluttered up with content, with chats, with conversations that frankly no longer need to be kept around. Another good feature that is built right into Microsoft 365 that Teams can take advantage of to really make sure that you're keeping your environment clean, that you're keeping everything controlled, that it's not just growing and growing and growing and expanding out of control. So, to wrap things up, Teams governance really affects all the things. It affects files in SharePoint and OneDrive, making sure those are staying in compliance, that you're keeping around only what you need, and that people are actually storing files where they're supposed to. They're not going out and storing them in Dropbox or Box or Google Drive or ShareFile. Managing those conversations in Teams, making sure conversations are staying appropriate, that information that shouldn't be shared within a conversation isn't being shared, that your sensitive information isn't escaping within those conversations. Managing the content in meetings, what people are sharing within those meetings on their screens or on their videos. Mail in the shared mailboxes that are associated with those Microsoft 365 groups. Ensuring that there's not content in there that shouldn't be. Permissioning of your end users. Blocking Teams creation. Putting some policies in place around that creation so you don't have 10 different HR sites because everybody in HR thought they needed their own site. Or you don't have 20 teams for every holiday party that you had over the last 20 years because people created a team, and that goes back to the retention. It didn't get deleted. Probably don't need a team that was created for planning a holiday party after the holiday party's done. So really, when you're thinking about Teams governance, don't just think about Teams, but think about your Microsoft 365 environment as a whole. With that, thanks again. I am sorry we didn't get to any demos. I have those YouTube videos out there. I'll post the link in the chat. Some of this is covered in some of my YouTube videos. If you do have questions, feel free to continue the dialogue in the chat. I'll be around to chat with you as well. or reach out to me on Twitter, reach out to me via email. You can see both of those here on the screen. The recording of this will be available shortly as well. Links to some of the stuff we talked about are actually in the notes of these slides. So if you go and grab the slide deck, there will be some links to different articles. But I want to thank you again for joining me for this session in the Scottish Summit. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, the rest of the sessions. I hope you enjoyed it up to this time. Thanks again for joining me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.